My earliest memory of knowing JonBenet Ramsey was when we were involved with choir together. We were in the Troublemakers choir.
The JonBenet Ramsey of the tabloids is not the JonBenet Ramsey that Sarah Bowles remembers.
She was outgoing and fun and just like really any other 5-year-old or 6-year-old kid. Yeah, I think the last time I saw JonBenet was at a Christmas concert that we did at the Boulder Theater in December of 1996.
Just days later.
In the shadowy corridors of the Burke Ramsey versus CBS lawsuit, a damning allegation emerges like a specter from the depths of investigative hell. The defendants in the Case of JonBenet Ramsey documentary launched what can only be described as a calculated assault on Burke's character, beginning their devastating attack by dissecting the haunting 911 call and recording. Their conclusion, a chilling narrative suggesting Patsy orchestrated the call as part of an elaborate cover-up after Burke committed the unthinkable act against his own sister. The pseudo-experts Clemente and Richards, like vultures circling their prey, declared with cold certainty that only 4 people inhabited that house of horrors on that fateful night. One lay dead, JonBenet herself. John and Patsy's voices echoed through the recorded evidence, leaving only one terrifying possibility. The only other person in the address at the time is Burke. Yet the lawsuit strikes back with fierce denial, explicitly stating that at the recording's end, Burke did not utter the incriminating words, "Well, what did you find?" The documentary's most devastating blow came through their relentless criticism of Burke's shocking indifference to his sister's disappearance. Like a prosecutor delivering a death sentence, they highlighted how Burke never asked Detective Patterson, who interviewed maybe an hour after JonBenet was found, if his sister had been found, what happened to her, when they're going to get her back. Nothing about his sister. The implications hung in the air like poison. His complete lack of concern suggested not innocence but complicity. This absence of basic sibling concern becomes even more damning when examined against the backdrop of childhood psychology and family bonds. Research in developmental psychology consistently demonstrates that children as young as 4 years old display protective instincts toward their siblings, often becoming distressed when separated even temporarily. Burke, at 9 years old, possessed the cognitive capacity to understand danger, loss, and the gravity of his sister's disappearance. His failure to exhibit even the most rudimentary expressions of worry defied every known pattern of sibling attachment and childhood emotional development. The timing of Burke's interviews adds another layer of disturbing context to his behavioral presentation. Detective Patterson's interview occurred mere hours after JonBenet's body was discovered, when the raw shock and horror of the situation should have been at its peak. This was not days or weeks later when emotional numbing might have set in. This was in the immediate aftermath when any loving sibling would be overwhelmed with questions, fears, and desperate concern. Burke's calm demeanor during this critical window suggested either profound psychological detachment or the eerie composure of someone already aware of the outcome. The documentary experts dissected every nuance of Burke's interaction with law enforcement, noting not just what he failed to ask, but how he failed to ask it. His body language showed no signs of the restless anxiety typical of children in crisis situations. He displayed none of the verbal urgency, none of the emotional volatility, none of the desperate seeking of reassurance that characterizes normal childhood responses to family trauma. Instead, they observed a child who seemed almost removed from the situation, as if watching events unfold from a safe emotional distance that suggested prior knowledge rather than genuine confusion or fear. More chilling still was their psychological dissection of Burke's unnatural calm. His sister disappears in the middle of the night. She ends up dead in the basement, and he doesn't worry about himself or worry that they may come back for him. He was in the house at the time, and he doesn't seem to be concerned at all. This narrative built to a crescendo with Dr. Suzanne Bernhard's interview, where Burke's failure to ask logical questions about JonBenet's fate painted him as unnaturally detached from the tragedy that should have consumed any loving brother. In a moment of stark confrontation during his Dr. Phil interview, Burke faced the accusation head on. A lead investigator's theory cut through the television studio like a blade. He was the culprit because he never asked about her welfare on that horrific day. Burke's response carried an eerie matter-of-factness. He was simply told, "Hey, we can't find your sister. What do you think happens?" And the next time I talked to somebody was she's dead. John Ramsey's book reveals another disturbing detail from Burke's police interrogation. Investigators asked what made him feel safe. The question itself was a trap, implying that any ordinary child, believing his sister kidnapped by an intruder, would never feel safe. Burke's supposed sense of security became yet another mark against him. John's 1998 interview with Smith and Kane exposed the family's growing paranoia as investigation focus remained on them simply because they were in the house. A friend's warning that police were not your friends triggered a complete reset of their perception of the investigation. The expectation that Burke would inquire about his sister's welfare stems from fundamental assumptions about how children typically respond to family crises. When a sibling goes missing, the natural instinct for most children would be to repeatedly ask questions about their whereabouts, express concern for their safety, and seek reassurance from adults about when they might return. This pattern of questioning represents a normal emotional response that demonstrates attachment, concern, and the child's attempt to understand and cope with an uncertain and frightening situation. The absence of such inquiries becomes notable precisely because it deviates from expected behavioral norms during family emergencies. Burke's communication pattern throughout various interviews reveals a reactive rather than proactive approach to information sharing. Rather than volunteering details, expressing curiosity about the investigation's progress, or offering memories that might be helpful, he consistently responds only to direct questions with minimal elaboration. This creates a dynamic where investigators and interviewers must extract information rather than receive it naturally. The pattern suggests either an unusual level of emotional detachment from the situation or a deliberate withholding of information, both of which raise questions about his relationship to the events and his sister's disappearance. The broader context of Burke's responses reveals a concerning lack of emotional investment in understanding what happened to his sister. Even years later, when given platforms to speak about JonBenet, his responses remain notably brief and factual rather than reflective or emotionally engaged. This sustained pattern over time suggests that his initial reaction was not merely shock or temporary emotional numbing, but rather indicative of a more fundamental disconnection from the tragedy. The consistency of this detached approach across different time periods and interview settings reinforces questions about whether this represents his genuine emotional state or a calculated presentation. Burke's explanation and child reasoning. 20 years later, Burke finally broke his silence on Dr. Phil, offering his own haunting explanation for his apparent indifference. His recollection carries the eerie simplicity of a child's logic. When told JonBenet was missing, he responded, "Well, she's probably just hiding somewhere. Like, you guys looked around the house?" The innocence of this assumption that his sister was merely playing a game becomes heartbreaking when contrasted with the brutal reality that followed. "The next time I talked to somebody was she's dead," he stated with chilling matter-of-factness. Burke's explanation reveals a troubling disconnect between the gravity of the situation and his casual interpretation of events. His suggestion that JonBenet might be hiding somewhere demonstrates either a profound misreading of the adult's panic and urgency or a deliberate minimization of what was clearly a serious crisis. The adults around him were frantically searching, calling police, and displaying obvious distress. Yet Burke's proposed solution was simply to look around the house more thoroughly. This response suggests either an inability to read social and emotional cues appropriately or a conscious effort to deflect from the true seriousness of the situation by offering innocent explanations. The timeline Burke presents raises its own disturbing questions about his experience that morning. His narrative jumps directly from being told she was missing to learning she was dead, with no mention of the hours in between when the house filled with police, friends, and investigators. This gap in his recollection, or at least his willingness to discuss it, eliminates the entire period when he should have been processing the escalating crisis, asking questions, and showing increasing concern as search efforts intensified. His compressed timeline suggests either selective memory or a deliberate omission of the crucial hours when his behavior would have been most revealing. Most unsettling is Burke's matter-of-fact delivery when recounting these events decades later. There's no emotion in his voice when describing the progression from missing to dead. No indication that this transition represented a traumatic shock that fundamentally altered his understanding of the world. For most siblings, learning that a missing brother or sister had actually died would represent one of the most devastating moments of their lives, a before and after moment that would be seared into memory with crystalline clarity. Burke's casual recounting suggests either remarkable emotional detachment or a relationship to these events that differs fundamentally from that of an innocent grieving brother. The psychological implications of Burke's hide-and-seek theory become even more disturbing when considered alongside the family's Christmas morning routine. JonBenet had just experienced one of the most exciting days of a child's year, surrounded by presents, family, and festivities. The idea that she would voluntarily disappear into hiding the very next morning, abandoning new toys in the warm afterglow of Christmas, defies basic understanding of child psychology. Most children would be eager to continue playing with new gifts, showing them off, or simply basking in the continued attention from extended family visits. Burke's suggestion that she might be hiding reveals either a fundamental misunderstanding of his sister's personality and motivations, or a calculated attempt to provide an innocent explanation for her absence. Furthermore, Burke's matter-of-fact acceptance of the transition from missing to dead raises questions about his emotional processing capabilities. The jump between these two states, from a potentially reversible situation to permanent loss, represents a psychological chasm that most children would struggle to navigate without intense emotional upheaval. His apparent ability to absorb this information without visible distress suggests either an unusual capacity for emotional compartmentalization or a prior awareness that made the news less shocking than it should have been. His decision to finally speak publicly came with its own dark reasoning. For a long time, the media basically made our lives crazy, he explained, describing how he became pretty skeptical of like any sort of media, transforming him into a very private person. The 20th anniversary forced his hand. There's still a lot of attention around it, dragging him reluctantly into the spotlight he'd spent decades avoiding. The Burke Ramsey versus CBS lawsuit fights back against the documentary's sinister interpretations with fierce determination. When experts suggested Burke excluded JonBenet from a family drawing because he'd eliminated her, the lawsuit counters with devastating logic. Burke drew Mom, Dad, and Byrne because that's the only family he had when he was asked to draw the picture. The suggestion that a child's art revealed consciousness of guilt crumbles under this simple explanation. Most chilling was the interpretation of Burke's response to Dr. Bernhardt's question, "What do you think happened?" When he replied, "I know what happened. Investigators saw confession." The lawsuit argues instead that by this time, Burke has a general understanding of what happened to JonBenet and would not be asking a child services investigator for confirmation. Burke himself later described feeling awkward talking about it, thinking everyone knew what had happened, leaving him confused why anyone would ask again. The night of the crime reveals its own disturbing details. John Ramsey checked on Burke fairly quickly after discovering the ransom note, finding him asleep still. The conscious decision to let Burke sleep, believing it was the best place for him to be for a while, takes on ominous undertones in hindsight. Patsy confirmed that John verified Burke's slumber, while JonBenet never awakened the whole time from the car to bed that night, describing her daughter as really zonked from Christmas festivities. John's psychological profile of his son reads like a clinical assessment. Burke was introspective and quiet, and often seemingly indifferent or distant when under intense pressure, traits John claimed they shared. Most telling was his observation that Burke didn't want to talk about his sister's death, but he also didn't answer questions about neglect, exploitation, or inappropriate contact the way a victimized child might. This absence of expected responses became its own form of evidence. Burke's own self-assessment during the Dr. Phil interview paints him as simply a normal kid who is a little like reserved. He attributed his emotional flatness to personality and situational awkwardness. His denials came swift and absolute. He never harmed his sister, never touched her inappropriately, never struck her with any weapon. The single incident he admitted, accidentally clipping her with a golf club during a backswing, carried no malicious intent. His knowledge extended only to what everybody else already knows about that night. His theory of the crime reveals a child's attempt to make sense of senseless tragedy, a crazy person who saw her at one of the pageants and snuck in. Yet even his expression of anger that he resents the person that did it for throwing a wrench in my life and my family's life focuses more on personal impact than grief for his lost sister. Forensic questioning and passive omissions. The Burke Ramsey versus CBS lawsuit unleashes its most scathing attack on the documentary's pseudo-experts Clemente and Richards, branding them totally unqualified to perform a psychological analysis of a child based on a video interview. Like amateur surgeons wielding scalpels, they relied on preconceived dialogue designed to imply Burke's involvement, crafting a narrative of guilt from fragments of childhood behavior. Clemente's methods border on prosecutorial misconduct, knowingly and falsely suggesting a quasi-confession by twisting Dr. Bernhardt's questions into Burke's supposed answers. They accused him of disturbing behavioral problems, using every psychological theory as ammunition to paint Burke as a lying sociopath who committed the ultimate betrayal of family bonds. The documentary's psychological warfare extended beyond mere misinterpretation into the realm of character assassination through selective editing and manipulative presentation. These so-called experts cherry-picked moments from hours of interview footage, stripping away context and nuance to create a damning highlight reel of suspicious behavior. They transformed normal childhood fidgeting into signs of deception, reframed age-appropriate responses as evidence of callousness, and weaponized every pause, gesture, and facial expression as proof of guilt. Their methodology resembled less a professional analysis than a prosecutorial brief designed to convict rather than understand. The power dynamics at play in these expert interpretations reveal a disturbing willingness to sacrifice a child's reputation on the altar of sensational television. Clemente and Richards position themselves as omniscient interpreters of human behavior, claiming the ability to decode guilt from grainy footage of a traumatized 9-year-old. Their confident assertions carried the weight of professional authority, yet their conclusions contradicted fundamental principles of child psychology and forensic interviewing. They ignored the well-documented effects of trauma on children's emotional expression, dismissed the impact of repeated questioning on a child's responses, and showed no consideration for the possibility that Burke's behavior might reflect adaptive coping mechanisms rather than criminal culpability. Most insidiously, these experts created a psychological trap where any response Burke gave could be interpreted as suspicious, a classic double bind that made innocence impossible to prove and guilt inevitable to infer. John Ramsey's book exposes how every gesture became evidence of guilt. Patsy's tears through splayed fingers and his own nervous pacing were dissected by officers as proof we didn't act right. In this twisted logic, even grief could be weaponized, transforming natural responses to trauma into calculated performances of innocence. Patsy's suspicions of others, Chris Wolf, Fleet White, Priscilla White, Bill McReynolds, persisted because she received no significant information concerning her child's death in the last 2 years that differs from the information that you received prior to your interviews. The absence of exonerating evidence became its own form of conviction in her mind, trapping her in an endless cycle of suspicion. Former Chief Beckner's 2015 revelations paint a disturbing picture of investigative frustration. Officers noted how distant John and Patsy seemed to be toward each other. Even marital dynamics became suspicious. Burke remained forever out of reach, with police never given an opportunity to interview him again after brief initial contact. His unwillingness to submit to an interview a few years ago became part of a typical Ramsey response, a pattern of non-cooperation that investigators interpreted as guilt. The February 1998 police news release reads like a declaration of war. Commander Beckner demanded 3 key interviews that need to be conducted with John Ramsey, Patsy Ramsey, and Burke Ramsey. When requests for John and Patsy were declined, negotiations with Burke continued until February 15th, when everything collapsed over media leaks. Beckner's conclusion rang with frustration. It is in the best interest of this investigation that Burke be interviewed, and we are ready to interview him. The concept of normalized dysfunction within family systems explains how individuals can perceive highly unusual circumstances as routine when they represent their entire lived experience. Children who grow up in environments where certain behaviors, communication patterns, or family dynamics are consistently present will internalize these as standard, regardless of how they might appear to outside observers. This normalization process means that even when faced with external scrutiny or questions about their responses, individuals may genuinely believe their reactions are appropriate and typical. The lack of external reference points or challenges to their understanding prevents them from recognizing that their family's functioning might deviate significantly from societal norms. Burke's interview responses demonstrate a doubling down effect, where he maintains his position that his reactions and behaviors were normal despite external feedback suggesting otherwise. This reinforcement of his original stance, rather than showing any reflection or reconsideration of his responses, indicates either a genuine belief in the appropriateness of his behavior or a defensive mechanism to avoid acknowledging problematic patterns. The absence of any evolution in his understanding or presentation over time suggests that he has not internalized alternative perspectives about his responses, which could indicate either limited self-awareness or a conscious decision to maintain his established narrative. Adults who experience unusual childhood circumstances often undergo a process of realization as they gain broader life experience and exposure to different family systems and social norms. This recognition typically involves understanding that certain childhood experiences or learned response patterns were not healthy or typical, leading to personal growth and behavioral changes. However, the absence of this developmental progression in Burke's case, his continued insistence on the normalcy of his responses without apparent growth or reflection, suggests either an incomplete developmental process or a deliberate resistance to acknowledging that his childhood responses might have been unusual or concerning. Burke's confident assertion, "I know what happened," represents a significant linguistic choice that differs markedly from the more tentative, "I think that was actually requested in the question." This shift from speculative to declarative language suggests a level of certainty that goes beyond what would typically be expected from someone piecing together events they didn't directly witness. The definitiveness of his response implies access to information or understanding that allows him to speak with authority rather than uncertainty, which raises questions about the source of this confidence and whether it stems from direct knowledge or reconstructed understanding of events. The physical presentation accompanying Burke's verbal response adds another dimension to the communication that extends beyond mere word choice. His body language reportedly showed increased engagement and forward-leaning posture, suggesting heightened investment in this particular aspect of the conversation compared to his typically reserved demeanor. This physical animation contrasts with his generally withdrawn presentation throughout other portions of interviews, indicating that this topic specifically triggered a different level of engagement and energy that wasn't present during other discussions. The emphatic nature of Burke's delivery combines both his confident verbal assertion and animated physical presentation to create an overall impression of certainty and investment in conveying his understanding of events. This emphasis stands out particularly because it represents a departure from his usual communication style, which tends toward brevity and emotional flatness. The combination of declarative language and engaged body language suggests this moment held particular significance for him, whether because it represented an opportunity to demonstrate his knowledge or because the topic itself triggered a different level of emotional or intellectual engagement than other aspects of the interviews. In this web of passive omissions and forensic questioning, every silence screams, every absent tear condemns, and every failure to ask the right question at the right time becomes evidence in an investigation where behavior itself stands trial alongside the truth. The truth may never be legally proven, but the shadows of that truth continue to darken everything they fall upon. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more storytelling analysis like this.